Identifying what the Bears front office values most. Today we are going through our front office's draft history and seeing what Ryan Poles, Ian Cunningham, and Matt Eberflus's teams have drafted in the last 15 years. My man Preston Weidman put a lot of work into this one. He charted Ryan Poles' draft history from 2009 to 2023, paired with Ian Cunningham's history since 2017 and Matt Eberflus's history since 2018. He charted every pick from each regime over the first 5 rounds of the draft and created some pie charts for me. Amazing work. It gives us an insight into what our front office might value. It makes a ton of sense, and the charts look pretty much how I would expect them to based on Ryan Poles' premium positions. So in the first round, 40% of the picks have went towards either defensive end or wide receiver, both premium positions. 20% of the first round picks were wide receiver, and 20% were spent on defensive end, the clear favorites in the first round. This is limited data. You can see that offensive tackle and cornerback are not far behind, both coming in at 13.3%. Those are the clear top 4 options when it comes to the first round pick: cornerback, offensive tackle, wide receiver, and defensive end. Those are the 4 positions I would expect Poles to choose from when it comes to making a first round pick. The only other option outside of those top 4 I think would be defensive tackle. When you move to the second round, you see similar results, but linebackers, guards, centers, and safeties percentages go up. The second round is a great spot for guards, safeties, linebackers, and centers. We got Jaquan Brisker in the second round last year and Tevin Jenkins in the second round the year before. This is a great year to add a center in the second round, but it's such a great center class, we can wait until the 4th or 5th and still bring in a quality center. When you go to the third round, it's defensive end, cornerback, defensive tackle, offensive tackle, and running back. The likelihood of adding a running back in the second or third round is definitely possible. When moving into the fourth round, they seem to prefer wide receivers and safeties. Corners and defensive ends are popular in every round, 1 through 5. I wouldn't be surprised if Ryan Poles adds a corner or a defensive end at any point in the entire draft. Tight end has a huge spike in the 5th round, and so do quarterbacks. Part of that was an outlier as the Chiefs selected 3 quarterbacks in the 5th round. None of those guys worked out, so I don't know if it's still something that Poles values. Overall, the positions that are drafted most are easily receivers, corners, and defensive end. Linebackers, safeties, and running backs were next on the list, with offensive and defensive tackles not being drafted as much, but usually being drafted higher. That is the important thing to note here. Offensive tackles were drafted most in the 1st round. Defensive tackles were drafted most in the 3rd round. This is interesting and can help us narrow down the odds of where Ryan Poles goes in next week's draft. The number 1 spot is wide receiver. But after adding DJ Moore, Chase Claypool, and Velus Jones Jr. to a room with Darnell Mooney and Equanimous St. Brown, I would say receiver is not a huge need heading into the draft. Could Poles still take a receiver early? Of course, but it's not a pressing need, so I wouldn't be surprised if he passes on addressing the position on day 1 and 2. Next up is cornerback, another position on our roster that is talented with Jalen Johnson, Kyler Gordon, Kendall Vildor, Michael Ojemudia, Jalen Jones, and more. It's a talented group, but Poles will probably add at least 1 corner from this very deep draft class. Corner's definitely an option in the 1st round, but we should be able to find an upgrade over Kendall Vildor all the way into day 3. I expect a corner to be drafted. Next up is defensive end. This is where Ryan Poles should attack the draft. It's a position he values as a premium, it's an extremely talented draft class, and it's a huge need on this roster. There is absolutely no reason Ryan Poles shouldn't add at least 1 defensive end during the draft. I would like him to bring in at least 2, honestly. Poles could add a pass rusher in the 1st round. It's definitely a possibility, but more than anything, I want him to take at least 1 shot on day 2 or day 3 because this pass rush class is just so deep. The next position I want to talk about is offensive tackle. It's not a position they've drafted a ton, but it's one that when they do draft a tackle, it's most likely to happen early in the draft, with the first round being the most likely. This is interesting, and I think it makes it more likely they add a tackle in round one. I don't think anything is set in stone, but I would not be surprised at all if we leave day one with an offensive tackle. Next up is defensive tackle, which did not have a ton of investments, but it's a huge need and a key to Eberflus's defense at 3-Tech. All three regimes had great players at defensive tackle on the roster, so they didn't necessarily need to invest much draft capital into defensive tackle. Things are different here in Chicago, where we lack a single building block at the position and definitely don't have a single all-pro caliber player on the entire defensive line. So this is one position where I think Poles will invest more draft capital into. I expect one or two defensive tackles to be added and wouldn't be surprised at all if we took one in round one. Jalen Carter isn't the only option either. Kalijah Cansey, Brian Brzee, Adetomiwa Adebawore are other options, especially if we trade down. The last position I want to talk about is the center position, which I think needs to be addressed. In Kansas City, Poles drafted center Creed Humphrey in the second round. In Philly, the Eagles had Jason Kelce, and in Indy, Eberflus's teams had Ryan Kelly. All three teams had top-tier centers. The Eagles even drafted Cam Jurgens on day 2 last year. Even though Kelce hasn't retired yet, he's just sitting in the background waiting. So I believe center is another position that Poles will value and address in this upcoming NFL draft. It makes sense, especially since there's a lot of talent at the position in this year's class. Huge shout out and thanks so much to Preston Weidman for putting together these charts and research for me. He sent me this stuff on Twitter and I asked him if it was okay if I used it in a video, and he agreed. What shocked him the most out of this research was that out of the 117 draft selections, only 17 picks were used on the offensive line, which is 14.5%, meaning the same amount or more selections were invested at wide receiver and cornerback than the entire 5 spots on the offensive line from the 3 franchises that he charted. Great tidbit there from Preston Weidman. Much appreciated. Anyone else is welcome. If you guys have free time and like to put together research or statistics, send them to me on Twitter. I'll do what I can to make them into a video. Huge shout out to Preston for putting together this great information. Thanks so much to everyone who watches. Please hit that like button for me. And until next time, bear down.
Swifty in the house!